I recognized his handwriting the moment he slid the paperwork across my desk, the same handwriting from the divorce papers he'd served me 3 years before. Skip. Sentence is structural connective tissue. Removing or replacing it changes the narrative architecture beyond the scope of this criterion fix. I used to believe sacrifice was the same thing as love. I held onto that for 10 years, without ever asking what was on the other side of the door. I was 27, halfway through my medical residency, running on 4 hours of sleep and caffeine that had stopped working 2 rotations ago. And I was good. Not just surviving, good. My attending told me I had the kind of diagnostic instinct that couldn't be taught. The kind that catches what everyone else misses on the chart. Then I got pregnant. David. Back then he was still just David, not David Chen, self-made entrepreneur. Sat across from me at our kitchen table with a spreadsheet of his own. His business was growing. Childcare would cost more than we had. Someone had to step back. He never said it should be me. He didn't have to. I became a number before I understood what I was losing, one of 40%, they'd say later, as if that made it ordinary. I told myself it was temporary. That word kept me breathing for almost a decade. By day, I packed lunches, scheduled pediatrician appointments, managed school pickups with military precision. By night, and this is the part nobody ever saw, I sat at our dining table with his supplier invoices spread across the same surface where our kids had eaten dinner. Caught pricing errors. Renegotiated vendor terms over email using his login. Flagged cash flow gaps weeks before they would have hit. David slept upstairs. I fixed his business downstairs. And somewhere around 2 a.m., when the house finally went quiet and the numbers were balanced, I'd open a medical journal on my laptop. Just to remember what my brain was built for. I had read the statistic once, 8.5 extra hours of household labor per week, compared to male colleagues, and I remember thinking it sounded like an undercount. I was carrying that and running a supply chain he didn't even know was broken. Here's what nobody tells you about becoming invisible. It happens one compliment at a time. Not yours. His. David, your margins are incredible this quarter. That was me. I restructured the vendor payment schedule in March. David, how do you manage logistics and still stay so hands-on? Also me. I'd spent 3 nights cross-referencing delivery routes against fuel cost projections. He'd nod, smile, accept it like air, something he was simply entitled to breathe. My medical identity slowly became a footnote. At dinner parties, someone would occasionally ask what I did before the kids. David would answer for me. She dabbled in medicine, swirling his wine. But she's happier now. I wasn't happier. I was useful. I had been useful for years. I was done confusing that with being loved. However, and this is the thing about being trained in diagnostics, you don't stop noticing patterns just because you've left the hospital. I started seeing things. His jaw clenching during calls he used to handle calmly. The way he rubbed his left shoulder after investor meetings. Elevated resting heart rate visible at his neck when he thought no one was watching. I was watching. I'm always watching. That's what they trained me to do. Then came the dinner that cracked everything open. A celebration. His biggest contract yet. 40 people in a private room. Champagne I'd budgeted for. A menu I'd coordinated with the caterer, because David doesn't know the difference between a dietary restriction and a preference. His longest-standing supplier, Gerald, found me near the bar. Shook my hand with both of his. I never thanked you properly. That renegotiation last fall saved our partnership. Your husband's lucky to have someone who understands margins like you do. David appeared behind me before I could respond. She just helps with little things. A laugh. A hand on my shoulder, steering me away. Gerald, let me introduce you to someone. Little things. I stood there, holding a glass of champagne I'd paid for from a budget I'd built, wearing a dress I'd chosen to represent a brand I'd shaped, at a party celebrating a contract I'd saved. And my husband called it little things. Something shifted, not in my face, not in my voice, but in every decision I made from that night forward. Each one a quiet brick in a wall he would one day walk straight into. I didn't confront him that night. Went home, put the kids to bed, sat in the dark with my laptop. I opened a new spreadsheet, private, password protected, and I began tracking everything. Invoices, vendor calls, late payments, his increasingly erratic expansion decisions, and his physical symptoms. Because trained instincts don't switch off just because a woman leaves a hospital. The first line I typed was clinical, precisi, devastating in its honesty. Current status, stable only with external support. If you've ever written something about your own marriage that read like a patient chart, tell me in the comments. I know I'm not the only one. He slept soundly upstairs while I typed the first line into a document I had not yet decided what to do with. He called me dead weight in front of his business partners, his neighbors, and his mother, and then he laughed. Saturday barbecue. His business partners and their wives scattered across the deck, neighbors nursing beers by the grill. Someone mentioned the new warehouse lease. I corrected a detail about the penalty clause, gently, almost without thinking. The kind of thing I used to do when we were still a team. The table went quiet. My husband set down his drink. Looked at me the way you'd look at a child who'd interrupted the grown-ups talking. Babe, you handle groceries. Let me handle business. Laughter rippled through the group. Not everyone, but enough. His mother laughed loudest. She'd always been careful with her cruelty before. Small cuts disguised as concern. But that summer, something shifted. The mask slipped. At a family lunch, she turned to me, my children right there at the table, and asked whether I ever regretted giving up on being a real doctor. She stretched that word out. Real. Like she was peeling back a scab. My daughter was 11. She looked at me, waiting. I smiled, changed the subject, passed the bread. That night I locked myself in the bathroom and pressed my palms flat against the tile floor. Cold. Grounding. I wasn't crying. Something worse than crying. I was completely still. The kind of still that comes after you've already absorbed the blow and your body hasn't decided yet what to do with it. He started coming home later. New cologne I didn't recognize. Shirts I'd never bought hanging in the closet. His phone, which used to sit face up on the counter, now lived in his pocket like contraband. One detail at a time. Spaced just far enough apart that any single one could be explained away. Together, they were starting to form a picture. One I wasn't ready to name yet, but couldn't stop seeing. RT, tag placement is correct here, but the preceding gap must be closed by adding an earlier tag as noted above. Then the influencer showed up. Her name appeared first in his tagged photos. 26 years old. Lifestyle brand. 40,000 followers. Draped across the passenger seat of the company truck I had helped finance. Within weeks, she was at his office launch event, standing in the spot I'd occupied at every opening before. Smiling from the corner of his desk where our family photo used to sit. He didn't hide her. That was the part that burned. Not the betrayal itself, the casualness of it, like I was furniture he'd already decided to replace. His social media told a story of self-made triumph. Every post erased a late night I'd spent reconciling accounts. Every caption credited hustle and vision for outcomes that had required my hands, my calculations, my corrections at 2 a.m. when the numbers didn't add up. He rewrote our history in real time. The audience applauded. I could have screamed, could have posted receipts, called his mother, confronted him at the office in front of everyone. Instead, I enrolled in an online medical refresher course at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. Used an email address he didn't know existed. What followed was a season of disciplined parallel living. On the surface, nothing changed. I packed lunches, drove carpool, attended his events when summoned, smiled when expected. Underneath, I was building architecture he couldn't see, a hidden savings account, funded by redirecting small consulting payments from vendors who still called me directly, the ones who remembered I used to run half his operation. A digital folder of every contract he'd signed in the past 18 months. I photographed them during his Saturday golf rounds, noted the risk clauses he'd ignored, the personal guarantees he didn't understand, the expansion deals leveraged against assets we jointly owned. 8.5 extra hours a week. I didn't need research to tell me that. I felt it in my hands every morning before he came downstairs. I knew that number. I was living inside it. I had been living that statistic for years. Except my unpaid shift extended beyond laundry and meal prep, it ran straight through his balance sheets. He never noticed. Not the studying, not the savings. RT. Not the slow, careful extraction of my fingerprints from his financial machinery. One Thursday night, he came home late, smelling like someone else's apartment. Found me at the kitchen table reviewing supplier invoices, the ones he'd forgotten to pay again. He leaned against the door frame, that half smile, the one designed to make me feel small. You wouldn't survive a month without me. I saved that date in my private folder. 14 months later, I would watch him prove himself exactly right. 5 words. That same afternoon, I had quietly covered a $12,000 payroll gap he didn't know existed, inside a business he claimed I couldn't survive without. Patched by the woman he'd just called dead weight. Something shifted behind my ribs. Not heartbreak. Not rage. Something clicked behind my ribs. Not heartbreak, not rage. The clean, quiet sound of a decision that had already been made. Of alignment. I looked at him the way I used to look at a patient chart with declining vitals and no family willing to discuss end-of-life care. Terminal prognosis. Life support still running. But the person keeping the machines on had just changed her mind. I stopped asking to be seen. Stopped correcting his stories at dinner parties. Stopped catching the invoices before they went overdue. By the time the divorce papers arrived, his idea, his lawyer, his timeline, I had already secured credentials, documentation, and enough financial separation to walk out standing. I signed without hesitating. He sat across the table, waiting. For tears. For begging. For the collapse that would prove he'd been right about me all along. What he got was a woman clicking a pen, writing her name, sliding the papers back with hands that didn't shake. The thing that changes everything isn't leaving him. It's what happens next, when I stop carrying his weight completely and the structure I've been holding begins to buckle under debts and decisions only I understood. The first supplier default notice arrived before I'd even changed the locks. And then, he thought the divorce was the finish line. For me, it was when I finally pulled the IV out of my own arm. No dramatic exit. No post crafted for strangers. No midnight calls asking friends to choose a side. I taped boxes shut on a Wednesday, hauled them into a 2-bedroom apartment on Thursday, and by Friday morning I was barefoot on cold tile, drinking coffee in a kitchen where no one would ever call me dead weight again. The quiet rang in my ears. That was the plan. The first supplier yanked their net 60 terms 6 weeks later. I remember the exact time because Diane from accounts called while I was folding laundry, and her voice had that tight, apologetic edge people use when they already know they're delivering bad news. "I'm sorry," she said, exhaling into the line. "I can't extend credit if contracts keep coming back with errors and no one calls us back." She wasn't trying to reach him. She reached me. Automatically. 4 years of late-night edits and last-minute saves had trained them to call the person who actually handled the work, not the name printed in bold on the letterhead. Ink had never changed the facts. By month 3, 2 vendor relationships collapsed completely. Not small ones. Structural ones. I had built those partnerships from scratch, voice notes at 11 p.m., revised terms before sunrise, catching decimal mistakes in purchase orders he approved without reading past the first line. Then the sequence started. Predictable, mechanical, ugly. A warehouse lease he'd signed during his expansion phase came due with a balloon payment hidden in clause 14.2. I can still see that number in my head. I would have flagged it in 10 seconds, pushed back, renegotiated, or walked. He signed and moved on. He always signed and moved on. One clause became a cash flow rupture. That rupture delayed payroll. Payroll delays bled staff. Staff losses shook client confidence. Clients canceled. Nothing exploded at once. It decayed. 18 months of slow collapse. I watched from a distance with the same expression I used to wear reading labs on a patient whose diagnosis was already obvious. Not joy. Not revenge. Just clinical recognition. He told people I was bitter. Called me incompetent. Said divorcing me was an act of mercy and that I had never brought anything meaningful to the company. At first, people nodded along over wine and appetizers. For maybe 4 months, the performance worked. Then reality got loud. Checks to contractors bounced. Certified legal warnings started landing at his office. The glass front suite became a smaller unit in a strip mall near the freeway, the kind with flickering lights and a vape store 2 doors down. And then the influencer disappeared. Not slowly. Overnight. The polished posts vanished, the restaurant openings, matching outfits, captions about building empires together. Tagged photos wiped. Profile cleaned. The luxury image he used to replace me broke apart, the second the money thinned enough for the skeleton to show. But before she left, she did one thing I never predicted. She found my number and called on a Sunday evening. I was at my sink with dish soap on my hands when the screen lit up. Her voice was nothing like the photos. Small, young, uncertain, stripped bare. "I just thought you should know," she said, then paused, like she was deciding whether to keep going. "He talked about you constantly. At dinner. On trips. Everywhere. He was obsessed with proving you wrong." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear and felt something slide into place behind my ribs. Not pain, not triumph. Recognition. The marriage. The public shaming. The rewritten history. None of it had really been about love. Not even about her. It was control. It was performance. He needed an audience of one, and he kept acting long after I had left the theater. That confession hit harder than every insult he ever threw at me. I rerouted everything. Every ounce of energy I once spent stabilizing his life, I put into rebuilding mine. Up to 40% of women leave medicine or move part-time within 6 years of residency. I had been gone almost 10 years. There was nothing graceful about returning. Recertification classes at night, clinical hours on weekends. Study guides open at 1 a.m. with highlighter ink on my fingers. At 40, I walked into hospital training beside residents who were 28. I could feel their eyes on me before anyone spoke. One afternoon in a hallway, I heard a whisper that wasn't meant for my ears. "Isn't she a little old for this?" My jaw locked. I kept walking. Month after month, I lived under fluorescent lights and alarm clocks set for impossible hours, while muscle memory crawled back into hands that had spent years balancing ledgers instead of holding a stethoscope. I came home exhausted enough to shake, but this fatigue felt clean. Earned. Mine. Then came the shift that split something open. 3 in the morning. 12 hours on my feet. Monitors beeping from every curtain bay. Antiseptic in the air. A young mother sat alone, clutching her son's hand so tight her knuckles blanched, terrified of a diagnosis she didn't understand. I pulled up a stool. I explained every term, one by one. When words failed, I drew a diagram on the back of a discharge sheet. Her breathing slowed while I talked. Her son finally stopped staring at the floor. When I stood to leave, she reached out and caught my wrist. "Thank you, doctor." 2 words. My throat closed so fast it hurt. The title hit me like oxygen after years of breathing through cloth, sharp, sudden, almost unbearable in its clarity. I remembered myself in that moment. Not the version bent around someone else's ego. The original one. The one that existed before spreadsheets, supplier calls, and strategic silence. That same month, his company filed for dissolution. I didn't celebrate. I barely registered it. By then, my life had already moved beyond his collapse and into my own momentum. The chapter was done, sealed, behind me. Until Tuesday morning at 6:45, when my receptionist knocked on my office door with a clipboard pressed against her chest, and that careful expression people wear when they don't know how bad the news is. "There's a walk-in," she said quietly. "He asked for you by name." She handed me the intake form. His handwriting, smaller now, unsteady, each letter trembling, filled the patient line beside a list of symptoms and debts where assets used to sit. Even through ink, I could see the shake in his hand. I stood there staring at the page, pulse steady, fingers still, while the waiting room door was already. The waiting room door was swinging shut behind me when I saw his shoes first, scuffed leather, the sole split clean along one edge, thread showing. Years ago, he wouldn't wear anything that didn't come in an Italian box with tissue paper and a receipt he liked to leave on the counter. Now he sat under humming fluorescent lights in a molded plastic chair, a paper number pinched between his fingers like everyone else in line. I didn't say his name. Not yet. At my desk, I opened his intake form and read it the way I read every new chart, line by line. No attachment, no story, just facts. Blood pressure high. Sleep fractured for months. Chronic fatigue. Unintentional weight loss. Stress-triggered gastric episodes. Under current medications, he had written, none. Can't afford. Under occupation, the space was empty, just a hard stop where a title used to be. When I called him in, he rose slowly and followed me down the corridor, the antiseptic smell sharp in the air, rubber soles squeaking behind us. In the exam room, he lowered himself onto the paper-covered table, hands clasped between his knees, shoulders folded inward. He looked like a man who had run out of rooms where people stood up when he entered. "You look well," he said, barely above a whisper. I didn't answer that. I turned to the screen, opened his chart, and asked when the symptoms began. He gave me every clinical answer like he was reciting for an exam: insomnia, chest tightness, panic spikes after his second creditor filed suit, appetite gone, mornings worse than nights. But within minutes, the real script pushed through. The company was finished, liquidated. His mother stopped taking his calls once the money disappeared. The influencer was gone long before that, leaving him with a joint credit card balance and an apartment lease signed in both names, now unpaid. When we talked health, he was vague. When we talked regret, he was precise down to the week. "I made mistakes," he said, leaning toward me. "With us. With everything." Then his eyes searched my face for it, the crack, the old softness, the reflex where I used to comfort him before he even finished the sentence, then solve the problem he created while he called it leadership. That woman was gone. She dissolved years ago between a midnight spreadsheet, a silent nursery monitor, and my signature on divorce papers that shook once and then didn't. I took his vitals without speaking. Cuff, stethoscope, pulse ox. Beep. Inflate. Release. I documented, ordered labs, flagged follow-up, and kept my voice steady. Everything deliberate. Everything professional. The same discipline that carried me through overnight residency shifts, payroll crises he never noticed, and the long climb back into medicine that so many women never recover after stepping away. Nearly 40% in my lane don't fully return. Then he said it. We could try again. Rebuild. He swallowed. You always knew how to hold things together. The sentence sat between us in sterile air and machine hum, and I felt that same recognition settle, not in my chest, in my clarity. There it was. Stripped clean of charm and performance, finally audible for what it was. Not love. Not accountability. A request for infrastructure. You always knew how to hold things together. He wasn't asking for a wife. He was asking for labor, systems, emotional logistics, unpaid executive function with his name on top. I set my pen down and looked at him directly for the first time since he walked in. You were never supporting me. My voice stayed level, clinical, the same tone I used to explain difficult findings. I was supporting you. That business ran on work you didn't pay for and expertise you mocked in public. When I withdrew that support, the underlying condition became visible. That isn't a marriage failing. That's a diagnosis. He stared at me. No argument arrived. His jaw shifted around silence, the way it used to shift around excuses, but this time there was nowhere to place them. The evidence already existed: bankruptcy filings, creditor actions, the blank occupation line on a form in my clinic. I closed the note, completed the consult, and referred him to a colleague for continuing care and a sliding scale payment plan. Then I walked him to the door with no frost and no tenderness, only the clean neutrality I give every patient whose file I close at day's end. At the threshold, he paused, fingers on the handle. "Do you ever think," he asked, not looking at me, "about what would have happened if you stayed?" "I think about what happened because I left," I said. "I became a doctor again." The door clicked shut. For a moment, I stood alone in the exam room. No rush of victory. No bitterness rising either. Just that deep, quiet recognition in the bones. I was exactly where I belonged, and I had paid for that place myself. Through sleepless rotations, through colleagues who lowered their voices when they called mid-career returns impractical, through evenings, my children watched me study at the kitchen table while dinner cooled and understood persistence before they had words for it. I filed his intake form in archive. As the paper slid into place, his signature caught my eye one last time. The same handwriting, smaller now. Each letter pressed harder, like he had to force the line to hold. I close the drawer. Somewhere tonight, a woman is carrying a household, a paused career, and a partner who calls her work little things. She is reading medical journals at 2:07 a.m., with one eye burning, or fixing books no one thanked her for, wondering if anyone sees what it costs. I see it, because I was her. And next week, I'll tell you the part I still haven't said out loud.